These evenings that happen every other month, and will happen again in November as a bi-monthly, every other month event, are brought to you by three organizations. I just want to make sure you all know and appreciate them. The first organization is the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently seated, which has been sponsoring this activity. In the words of the minister here, Donna Scapper, she feels that this kind of an evening and this kind of a presentation is, to quote her, part of the mission of this church, which is something I think you'll think about already now and after the evening's over, maybe even more. That's a remarkable commitment on the part of a religious cleric, and she's been a wonderful host to these events, and we are very appreciative that she makes the church available for them. The second organization is the Left Forum. I think many of you know about it. Every spring it has a huge conference. This year it was at the end of June at Long Island University over in Brooklyn. And it is already engaged in planning Left Forum 2020, and you will be hearing about that in the months ahead. And the third organization that actually puts all of this together is Democracy at Work, which is the organization I work most closely with to produce these events. And we also produce a number of other events, and I want very, very briefly, I promise, to mention a few of them to you now. One of the things we have begun to do, we have produced our first book, and the book, this is it, is called Understanding Marxism. And the book was written because of the number of inquiries coming into us by email, through Facebook, Twitter, you name it, people asking, and I mean this quite sincerely, what is it? That is, what is Marxism? Where does it come from? What's it about? Is it as evil as my mother told me it was? And so forth. Ever since we started becoming as big a public operation as we now are, with our radio show and TV show and all the rest that we do, all of which you can find out about by going to the website democracyatwork.info, which is where you can get all the information you could possibly want, and actually more than that. Ever since we started doing that, people are asking us questions, and it's literally overwhelming. We can't handle the number of emails. I mean, it's a good problem to have, given our politics, that America is as open to this. And by the way, we are all over the world, so we get them from literally every country. So this is a book that was designed to give an introductory overview, both of what Marxism is and how it has changed, particularly in the last 40 or 50 years. If you live in the United States, these changes are mostly, unless you're a very unusual person, unknown to you because they get exactly no coverage. Neither in the press nor in academic circles, I know, because those are the circles I travel in. If you are interested in this book, either as someone watching this program through the internet or someone here in the live audience tonight, if you're in the live audience, the books will be for sale. They're inexpensive. It's not a big fat book. You can get it on your way out. If you're watching, very simple. You go to lulu.com, LULU.com. Put in my name, Richard Wolff, and you can order the book there. It's available both in this hardcover and for a good bit less money. This, I think, runs $20 or $25. It's not expensive, but you can also get an ebook, which is even cheaper, I think $9 or something like that. So you can get it in whatever way you want. Second, this series, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update, GCLEU, has its own Patreon page. If you know what Patreon is, it's a fundraising website. If you're interested in supporting us, which we certainly would welcome, you go to patreon.com, GCLEU, and you can do that, and we would, of course, be grateful. The same is true for our YouTube channel. If you know how these things work, you can sign up to be a subscriber of the YouTube channel. Hit that little bell button, and you can be informed every time we put something new up on the YouTube channels that we maintain, which is several times a day. So there's lots of material there. We also encourage people who might want to sponsor one of these evenings. It's very simple. If you want to do that, go to democracyatwork.info/sponsor, and it'll explain to you how to do that. In addition to our weekly radio and television program called Economic Update, which is available, I want to tell you all, it's broadcast as a radio program on just under 100 stations, radio stations across the United States. It is also produced simultaneously as a television program. It goes out through the Free Speech TV network and a couple of other networks and goes into roughly 55 million American homes. Given what you're about to hear, if you haven't been at one of these before, you will recognize that there's even a historic significance to this sort of thing being available to the American people on a scale that has not been the case before. We're also expanding. We produce podcasts. That is, we produce whole series of presentations by people who do one every couple of weeks, and we, at our websites and so forth, you can go and you can also listen to them on iTunes and Google Play and all the platforms where we have people that have something to contribute to the kind of movement we hope to be part of and building. And you can also find out about those. One of them is called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. That is done by David Harvey. Some of you know him. He's a professor at the City University of New York. He does a regular one. A lawyer who's close to us in Puerto Rico has a running commentary on events in Puerto Rico having to do with both the problems and the struggles that are going on there. Capitalism Hits Home, Dr. Harriet Fraud, some of you know because she works with me on the radio and TV programs, talking about how capitalism shapes personal life, home life, intimate relationships, all of that. And we're about to launch a new one called All Things Co-op, a kind of an ongoing update about all kinds of efforts to build cooperative workplaces as alternatives to capitalist hierarchical workplaces around the country. So if any of those are interesting to you, go to the website. You can find out everything there. I've been asked to let you all know that there is a major climate change demonstration, if I understand correctly, on the 20th of this month, a week from this Friday. Does anyone here have the specifics of time and place? Because I don't have them and I'd love to let everybody know. Yes? Foley Square at noon. Okay, so. Okay, so 12 to 5, meeting at 12 o'clock, Foley Square, Friday, September 20. And Greta Thunberg will be there, as I am told. So she will be the kind of leader which, given her role over the last few months, she clearly deserves.
I heard this morning was great.
Yes. I do not think that Donald Trump will be there. But where is Foley Square? Does someone give me some help here?
It's down by the courts.
It's the Brooklyn Bridge stop, I think, on the number 6 train. 4, 5, and 6. Okay. Close to City Hall. All right. Last time we were here was a couple of months ago. Since this is an attempt to update you on things that have been happening in the world economy, are there empty seats around? Because I think we're beginning to run out. Anyone have an empty seat? Wave your hand so that folks coming in can. There are some seats up here. There are 2 of them, I think, here, 3. So if you want seats up front, you don't have to sit on the floor or stand. Unless you'd like to. That's, of course, fine. Okay. So let's jump in, make use of our time. An enormous, and you know, I do this for a living, this watching the economy and explaining and trying to interpret it. But I can't remember a month or 2-month period as chock full of explosive transformations in the world economy on a scale of the last 2 months. So it was difficult for me to focus in on what to stress with you tonight, because there really is so much. Let me give you an overview of what I mean by so much. One of the great empires of the world, the British Empire, is in the final months of disintegration. In the last 2 days, the Supreme Court of Scotland explained to the Prime Minister of Great Britain that he was in violation of the law and could not end the meetings of Parliament. I mean, what I just said is staggering. On some levels, the British invented the modern Parliament. And to have reached the point where the only way forward that they can possibly think of is to shut down the elected. Imagine if, well, that isn't so hard, is it? Imagine if Mr. Trump were to tell the senators and the representatives to go home, which is what they're trying to do in England, basically go home for the period roughly mid-September to mid-October.
He can legally do that.
Yes, well, that's the question. The Supreme Court of Scotland just decided he cannot.
No, Trump can do that.
Yeah, Trump can do it, right? But it's an open question. Mr. Trump clearly has the Supreme Court on his side. For those of you who did not notice, the Supreme Court gave him today, this afternoon, the right basically to deny asylum to refugees, to force them to ask for asylum before they get to the United States, and to arrange to have it denied in Mexico or wherever they might be coming. That was a tough case. They were supposed to not have that go through while it's being appealed. The Supreme Court said the law can apply while it's being appealed, which will deny entry to refugees in a way that really is a major break from much of American, not all of American history, but much of American history in terms of its opening. But let's go back to England. That was once the great empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Britannia rules the waves. Or, as the critics said, Britannia waves the rules, or whichever way you like. They waved the rules in order to be able to rule the waves. They're done. They are finished. They are probably finished no matter what happens now. And that is a major end of what was an empire of some several centuries in building itself up and ruling. That is a major change. Here's another one. In many countries of Europe right now, the central banks, and we're talking Germany and other major countries, are so desperate about the recession hitting Europe now. That's a Europe that isn't out of the last capitalist crash of 2008 yet, is now about to be hit by another, that they have taken an extraordinary step of reducing interest rates, hoping that people will borrow cheap money and so buy things or invest in their companies. When that didn't work, they took the next logical step. They now have, for trillions of dollars, negative interest rates. Here's how that works. You take $100 and you give it to the bank. And at the end of the year, they give you back 97. Do you understand? You don't get interest, you pay interest for them to hold your money. Now imagine if you are, but this is serious, imagine if you are an older person. Luckily, nobody in this room is an older person. But if you were an older person and you were relying on what you thought were secure savings paying you an interest, you will now face a situation where in your declining years, whatever money you're putting away will shrink every year. So you'll have the lovely experience. The prices will go up and your savings will go down. This is called not good. Or rather, not good for you. It has extraordinary consequences. And yesterday, Mr. Trump, the President of the United States, referring to the Federal Reserve, the most important monetary authority in the United States and in many ways in the world, not only called them, I quote, boneheads. Interesting. He named Mr. Powell the head of the Federal Reserve. The whole collection of them are boneheads. Why? Because they haven't lowered interest rates, including negative interest rates. In Europe, the move to negative interest rates has not overcome or stopped the impending recession. Mr. Trump, choosing carefully what facts he admits into his brain and not, and the people around him likewise, seems not to get that, so he wants to do that here. We'll come back to why he's so desperate about the recession hitting here, which he is. Every time you hear President Trump talk about how great the economy is, please understand, he keeps saying that because it isn't. And that's going to be how you will, I'll go through with you why that shapes what he does. But these are extraordinary steps. Negative interest rates for trillions of dollars, collapse of the British Empire. Couple of others. The United States has been at war in Afghanistan for a long time. Little details for you to think about. The Taliban, the ostensible enemy of the United States, against which the invasion was launched, are now controlling a significantly larger part of Afghanistan than when the United States invaded. Or to say the same thing in plain English, the United States has been defeated in Afghanistan, which every major newspaper in Europe has as a headline, and has already for months. Here in the United States, where you live in a media bubble, this is not made a big thing of. By the way, not just by conservatives and Republicans, but by the good old New York Times as well. But it is a reality. So glaring is that reality that it is dangerous for Mr. Trump's reelection. He may be attacked by the Democrats, particularly if Warren or Sanders are major players, for what? For being the leader at a time of losing a war, not good for election purposes, which is why he came this close to meeting with the Taliban at Camp David 4 or 5 days ago. Mr. Trump's enemies, who don't want that, leaked that information. It got out, and Mr. Trump had to run in the other direction as fast as possible. But not just run in the other direction. Get that off the headlines. Stop letting people come to terms with this un-American fact that we just fought one of the longest, one of the most costly wars in our history, and we were soundly defeated by people much smaller, much less well-armed, and much poorer than we were or are. Not good to run on. And so you had to get the pressure off, and you had to get the headlines off. And how did you do that? 2 things. You told a story, an old story, about some very wonderful made-for-TV dramatic event in which a spy, that's always exciting, in Russia, even more exciting, was miraculously extracted by our noble CIA. I mean, this is, comic books can't do it this way. And it's exciting, and it gets the disaster of that war off the headline. And the second thing that was done, and I don't want anyone here to cry, was to fire Mr. Bolton, because that got him a lot of attention too, and you could have big discussion. Was he fired? Did he resign? Who cares? Even Mrs. Bolton doesn't care. Right? But these are very good because it gets that Taliban disaster off. Folks, these are signs not only of the chaos, but these are signs of the system can't function. It can't function. All right, let's turn then to a few introductory things. That was just to get you kind of in the mood. Big things are happening, somewhat scary, but also the level of change in our society is accelerating. You know, a great political strategist who was asked by his followers many years ago, "Why is everything going so slow?" gave them this answer: For decades, he said, nothing happens. And then in a few weeks, decades happen. You're beginning to move from the first to the second. Things are speeding up, and it's a little hard to keep up with it. All right, so let's begin. First, an item not connected to China, which is our major focus and these big questions, but something that is so powerful, a window into this United States at this point that I wanted to talk about it. We are in the state of New York, and the state of New York has a governor named Cuomo. And in order to get popular participation in the government, something he spends most of his life trying to avoid, he asked citizens to comment on the design of license plates. Some of you may have noticed this. So if you would like a different color or a different graphic, or I don't know, maybe you'd like a flower on it, or a real flower pressed into it, whatever, or a picture of your grandmother, whatever you might want, he was interested in doing that. So I want to stress to you, here's what he did not ask you to comment on, namely, how are license plates produced, where, and by whom, in case the American public, or at least the New York State public, would have a thought about that, wanting to have some input about something that we're hanging on the back of our cars, if we have one, or there's one on the back of a cab if you use that, or the bus if you ride that, etc. So for those of you who don't know, a little bit of background. License plates are made by prisoners in prisons, right? So the people who are sent to jail to punish them for whatever crimes they are convicted of are subjected to pressures, I'm trying to be polite here, to work. The going rate in New York's prisons for working and making license plates is 65 cents per hour. I need a moment of silence so that it can sink in. 65 cents an hour. Why is that possible? Since, of course, it violates the law about what minimum wages are, both the federal law, which says the minimum wage you can pay a person is $7.25 an hour, and the state of New York, which has a separate minimum wage, which is a good bit higher than that. But not in jail. There you can pay people 65 cents an hour. Why is that? Because people in jail do not have civil rights in the United States. Why not? Well, they don't even have the right to dispose of their own bodies. Or another way of saying it is, they are slaves. They have masters who can control them, bodily and mind. Why is that possible? Again, for those of you not familiar, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, a product of the Civil War that was supposed to have freed the slaves, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment did outlaw slavery, but it included, go read it, it's only 2 sentences long, won't take long, the 13th Amendment. It made one exception to the abolition of slavery. Prisoners. Inmates in prison were not subject to the prohibition on slavery. It was not outlawed. For those of you who don't know, the United States has the highest percentage of its population in prison of any country on this planet. And the overwhelming majority of them are not white. In other words, slavery wasn't abolished, it was moved. And the same people, or at least many of the same people who once were slaves, have their descendants now still slaves to the extent that they are in prison making license plates. Mr. Cuomo did not ask for any comment whatsoever on any of this. He would like your input on decorating the plates, but not on what, of course, matters more. Last point. I don't think you can find, even in this country's conservative population, an article or a book that would make the argument that the rehabilitation or even the punishment of a quote-unquote criminal should include not only being taken out of his or her home, family, community, not being incarcerated in a place where you can't go anywhere unless you have permission, not subject to the pressures, rules, assaults that we all know are part of prison. That's not enough. You have to be made to work for 65 cents an hour and to be treated like a slave. What kind of rehabilitation would you imagine that accomplishes in a person to have their freedom taken away and to be required to live for years as a slave? If you want to know why we have a high rate of recidivism in this country, recidivism is the formal word for people who go finish their sentence, go out into the world, and come back into jail because they run afoul of the law again. Returners. We have a very high rate of recidivism. It might have something to do with treating people as slaves for a long period of time, given what we went through in this country to abolish slavery. It's an extraordinary reality. It is not unique to New York State. There are states that have a worse set of conditions than we do, but we're right up there. So if you thought you lived in a liberal state, not so much, not so much. Okay, next. I'm going to stay with the announced agenda because it'll be so hard to go through these topics. I can't do the normal opening where I give you a half a dozen of these short ones. We don't have the time. We have had some, and we're going to have some more, big nasty hurricanes. You all saw in the recent days what happened to the Bahamas when Dorian went through there. And you're watching our lovely president make sure nobody from the Bahamas comes here. We're helping them there, so they shouldn't come here. That has something maybe to do with the color of the people in Bahama, but we won't go there. We'll leave that alone. We'll pretend we don't notice that. That's not what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about hurricanes and the extraordinary lack of preparation for hurricanes. Every time, by the way, hurricanes, just for those of you that are not into meteorology, hurricanes are not, ready, new. They have been happening for centuries. And it's very convenient. They happen pretty much in the same place. I mean, some variation, but we kind of know where they form, how they blow, and a few miles this way, a few miles that way, sure. And for the people in that path, that's of course very important, but we kind of generally know. Okay? Minnesota doesn't have a lot of them. Florida has a hell of a lot of them, et cetera, et cetera. So we know what they can do, we know how strong they are, we've been through them, we have 8 million documents, films. Why in the world are why are we again suffering houses being destroyed, roads being what? What's going on here? Now the answer is, and it's really important, capitalism's incentive system. And I want to hammer at that because a number of you get told as you go through school, and on behalf of the school I want to apologize, you're told that one of the great virtues of capitalism is that it provides incentives. This is a very deep idea which says if you give someone a reward for doing something, they're more likely to do it. What this has to do with capitalism has always been a mystery to me, but it is used by people because they want to say, for which there's little evidence, that capitalism gives you more of an incentive than every other system gave its people incentives. For those of you who don't know, mathematics was invented long before there was capitalism, and lots of other delicious things that we rely on were invented without capitalism. So Why capitalism should get the prize for an incentive, I don't know, but that's not my point, even though I would enjoy spending time on it with you, as you can tell. Here's the problem with incentives. They cut lots of different ways. I'm going to give you a couple of examples having to do with hurricanes. We know perfectly well how to prepare a house, an individual home, an apartment house, anything else, to withstand hurricanes. We know how to do that. We've known how to do that for decades. Here's the problem. The home builder, who knows exactly how to do it, could do it for the houses he or she builds in the path of a hurricane. But here's the problem, you see. It's harder to sell the house to Americans who don't have enough money to buy a house if you equip it with what it needs to have to withstand a hurricane. So the builder, whose job it is not to prepare for hurricanes, but to sell the damn house, preferably at a profit, has no, ready, incentive to jack up the price of that house by doing what would be necessary. And he hopes like hell that the working class family, desperate to have a home of their own, barely able to afford the mortgage for this one, can be convinced into buying that house without looking real closely whether it is protected. You see, capitalism is based on profit, and the profit incentive produces crappy houses not prepared for hurricanes over and over again. So when someone tells you next time about capitalism incentive system, please remember this. Yeah, it has lots of incentives. And for every one that has a nice outcome, I will provide you with one with a hair-raising outcome, such as hurricanes. And the reason I stress this is because, having watched very closely the news reporting in this country about hurricanes, I have never heard any commentator ever make this argument on any radio or television program, which is why I wanted to present it to you. Next item. I can't get through it otherwise. I want to go to this collapse of the British Empire, not because of the interest it has in itself. And let me take a step back and tell you why you ought to be interested, everyone in this room. What is happening to England is what will happen here. It is our future. We are watching it unfold. Please, long after I'm gone, remember what I just said. It'll help you individually and as a citizen navigate through the disintegration of what you're observing. We are the colony of Great Britain. We are part of that history of that empire. True, we've reversed the roles. From them being the big shot and we being the puny, we have turned it around. But that doesn't mean we're gone from that history. It is our history, a desperate history. So let's review what happened there to put it in a context. First, most important, the crash of 2008 and 9, devastating in England. In its own way, as powerful in England, maybe more so than it was here. So many of you lived, maybe all of you lived through the crash of the last decade since 2008. So you know all the effects here. Well, think of England, it's worse. For example, if you adjust wages for prices, what we call the real wage, how much people got paid, but adjusted for the prices. So if you got 10% more wage, but all the prices went up 10%, you're not any one step further ahead. That's all the word real means, adjusted for price. Adjusted for prices, American average wages are flat. We've gone absolutely nowhere in the last 10 years. We've, as a working class, we've produced more and more wealth, but we didn't get it. It went somewhere else, and you kind of know where it went. Okay. England, not the same story. In England, the real wage dropped by over 10% over the last 10 years. Try to imagine what that means. A working class subjected to the crisis of 2008, sudden vast unemployment, losing their homes because they couldn't make their mortgage payments. But also, when they went back to work, having to take lower and lower wages, all of them. It's a devastating attack on the British standard of living. And it drove the British people not crazy, but made them very angry, very bitter, very casting about. And again, listen to me, because it's not so different from what happens here. Again, it's our history coming a few minutes or a few hours or a few weeks or a few months before it hits here. But the British working class, desperate. Desperate. They didn't know what to do. The left wing in Britain, which is represented by something like the Democratic Party here, only there it's called the Labour Party. Our Republican Party here is roughly their Conservative Party. If Conservative and Labour are their two parties. There is an important difference that the people in charge when the crisis hit were people who were gung-ho for modern capitalism. The Labour Party was once a socialist party. Explicitly and by self-definition, they were a socialist party. But in the modern period, since the 1990s, they stopped with their socialism. And their leader became a person very similar to, say, Bill Clinton. I don't want to say good words or bad words. Well, let's put it this way. I don't have any good ones. I don't want to say bad ones. But it's sort of that. And the British working class had no use for that, felt betrayed by all of that. And so the British working class didn't know where to go. They were so angry at the left for betraying them, for not protecting them, not even keeping their wages flat the way it was done here, but losing them and losing their public services. The most important public, well, not the most important, but one of the most important public services in England is their National Health Service, the NHS. Their single-payer, basically, healthcare system, the kind of thing we hope maybe one day we'll have. They've already had it for decades. But it's being destroyed by the conservatives who pull away funding, the classic way to kill this kind of thing. So they were losing their health care, their wages were going, it was a disaster. And so they walked away from their traditional support of the Labour Party, much like workers in this country walked away from their traditional support of the Democratic Party. But they didn't know where to go, because voting for the Conservatives, which some of them did, was hard. Britain has unlike America, Britain has a much more developed what we used to call class consciousness. Working class people know that they're that. Their mother and father were that, and they expect to be that. They don't have this idea, well, I'm going to work real hard, go to school, and I'm going to get a wonderful, better job that's going to boost me right out of the working class. Isn't that wonderful? They don't think like that. I mean, some do, but in general, they don't. They expect the Labour Party to be for the working man and woman, and it just wasn't. So they turned, some of them, to vote for the Conservatives, and even more of them stopped participating in politics. Again, familiar this should strike you. Then, 2 or 3 years ago, an interesting thing happened. The old leadership of the Labour Party stood down, and a new leadership had to be elected. And one of the old left-wingers, who was always on the edges, the old militant kind of trade unionist type of guy, socialist, well-known, whose name you now know, Jeremy Corbyn, stood for election as the head of this party. Imagine if Bernie Sanders, not running for president, had stood for the head of the Democratic Party. It doesn't work the same way here, but just roughly. But now imagine that he won, because Jeremy Corbyn brought about 300,000 young British working class people, and some students and so forth, into the party, joined the party in order to vote for him as leader. And he then took over, to the surprise of everybody, and has changed the Labour Party, and is trying now to reposition it to be the champion of the working class. But the bitterness of the working class is deep. They were betrayed for a long time, and Mr. Corbyn hasn't yet been able to make that work. He may not. It's hard to tell. So what do the mass of the British people do? They have nowhere to turn. They're furious at what's being done to them, but they have no organized way to go. And then a weird thing happened. A fight in the Conservative Party led Mr. Cameron, David Cameron, the Prime Minister 2 ago, not Boris Johnson, not Theresa May, but the one before that, David Cameron, to make a fatal mistake. They began a politics inside Britain, which should strike you as familiar, to say to the British working class, we are going to identify what's causing the trouble. You know what's causing your trouble? Don't worry, it's not capitalism. It's not the crash of capitalism. No, no, no. Here's what it is. Ready? Immigrants. It's immigrants. Now in England, because it's not America, you can't quite call it non-white immigrants because there's a lot of immigrants in Britain who are white, who come from Eastern Europe looking for work, Polish workers, for example, a big group. So it didn't have the racial, it had some of that, but not like here where it's so clear. In England, it was the immigrants. The immigrants are coming in. They're taking advantage of us. They're using our good social services. They're making us poor. And you know something, it isn't just the immigrants. It is, get ready now, because again, like America, it's the foreigners. When you have a leader stand up and the foreigners are coming, hold on to your wallet. Because 2 minutes later, somebody's hand is going to be somewhere in your business. The foreigner. In England, who was the foreigner? Europeans. Britain was about to become, was already partly part of the European community. And if you're going to be part of the European community, there are rules you have to observe that have been worked out over decades of negotiations. One of them, you all know that, those of you who travel to Europe, no border control. You can move, say, from France to Italy, and where once you had to go through a border checkpoint and show them your passport, you don't have to do any of that now. And goods can travel back and forth, and working people can move to wherever the jobs are. Free movement of people. Aha, the British ruling class, the conservatives said, we know what the problem is. It's those damn immigrants. And it's those Europeans that are pushing their immigrants on us, not to speak of the Caribbean immigrants and the African immigrants and all of them. So what we need to do is to squash the immigrants. Cameron got very frightened with all of this. He got frightened for the same reason that British industry got frightened, because they need the immigrants. The immigrants are important workers, they work very hard, and they work very cheap. Clue, just like here. Just like here. So the Conservative Party split. You even had some people leave the Conservative Party to become an extreme right-wing party. If you see the name Neil Farage, that's one of their leaders and so on. So Mr. Cameron had a great idea. We're going to put it to a vote. He was sure he would win. Do we stay with Europe or do we leave? He was sure they'd win. Of course they stay with Europe. Why? Because Britain without Europe is a small, wet, offshore island of Europe. It has the enormous stature of Staten Island. It's a slight exaggeration, but not much. Not much. Britain without Europe really is kind of unthinkable. Especially now. So everybody was sure this would work out. The working class would vote to stay with Europe because it's crazy to go out. But they were wrong. Because that vote gave the working class in England an opportunity to take their middle finger and show the government, this is what we think about all of you. You have really shafted us, first with this capitalist system, then with the crash of 2008, then you bailed out the big banks, then you imposed an austerity on us, and our wages are going down, and our healthcare system is collapsing, and now you want us to vote for it. We're going to vote the opposite of what you want. And they voted to leave. Brexit. We're gone. Is that because they didn't want to be in Europe? It had absolutely nothing to do with it. An average British person today, I don't mean this disrespectfully, has no idea what this is going to mean because nobody really knows what it's going to mean because it's unreal. When you go, if you read the newspapers tomorrow, you will read about a secret document that was exposed today by a mistake that was made by the Conservative Party. History is full of these mistakes. A secret document prepared by the Conservative Party was exposed just today. And that contains a worst-case scenario for what could happen with Brexit if it happens as it's supposed to on Halloween. Another interesting idea. That's it. 31st of October is the day. By the way, Halloween is a British holiday. It's All Hallows Evening. It's where that comes from. Americans have trouble with foreign words, even if they're English. Anyway, it's Halloween. And this document indicates that the worst case scenario, let me be clear, the worst case scenario of what the British Conservative Party is proposing includes, ready, food riots in the streets, martial law. That's why I say it's the end. It's the end of this society. When they were exposed, the leader of the government said, well, that's the worst case scenario. That's not our base case. In other words, you are pursuing a policy whose worst case scenario is that? That's not a reason to avoid the policy if that's a possible outcome? What? They got caught. And so now the country is ripped apart. Capitalist interests who think they might get an advantage by being cut off from Europe want it to happen. Capitalist interests that are terrified of what will happen to them if you get cut off from Europe don't want it to happen. The working class is waking up with documents like the one exposed today, realizing that either way, they're screwed. They're screwed if they stay, because that's what they've been happening, being screwed for a long time. If they stay with what was screwing them, chances are it'll continue screwing you. But if they leave, they're for sure screwed. Because there's nothing changing inside British society. The same people will be running it then as running it now. And the British people all know that. They have nowhere to turn. Last point. This last week, for the first time, a sizable and significant group of British capitalists released a document in which they said the following. Brexit, it's called a no-deal Brexit. Is they don't make an arrangement, they just leave on the 31st of October. That is so dangerous for British society that we have changed our mind. That is the worst thing that can happen. Better for us would be a government led by Jeremy Corbyn. Folks, think. Bernie Sanders is recycling Franklin Roosevelt. The same conditions that made it possible for a Roosevelt to be president for 4 terms is evolving now, and they may also come to the opinion that this guy, weird with that socialism in his name, is less dangerous for us than who? The British capitalists did not hesitate to point the finger. They pointed at Boris Johnson, known in England as the British Trump, and said, he's worse than Corbyn. We're going with Corbyn. And if you follow this in English politics, you'll see that Mr. Corbyn is now being treated more and more by the media as a great statesman. 3 weeks ago, he was a raving leftist lunatic. But whew, how quickly When a society begins to disintegrate, these kinds of shifts are not at all unusual. But Britain is in the final stages of a reckoning with its own history. It began as a cold, wet, offshore island of Europe, and it is returning to that position, painful as it is, above all for the British, who keep imagining that what has happened to them either hasn't happened or will one day be turned around when another Shakespeare arises. Amazing, amazing what is going on. Okay, let me turn then for the rest of this evening to the major item, which is the economic warfare, because that's what it is, between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in many ways the defining struggle of our time, likely to remain so for quite a while. Not 100% clear, I mean, at least not to me, how this is going to end up. So if you thought I was going to tell you where this is going to go, I wish I could, but I can't. But I can give you some insights, I hope, into what is going on and why. Okay, I'm going to do it two different ways. The first way, I'm going to talk about the three different levels at which this war is being fought. And then we'll talk about, the winners, the losers, and all of the rest. First, the long run, the long perspective, the historical perspective. China is a rising power, an ascending economic and political powerhouse. Just a few facts for you, because these facts are crucial and should be the framework within which everything else that I say follows. Okay. The United States has roughly 325 million people. Right? China has 4 times that number of people. So we're not talking about societies that are equal. One has 4 people for every 1 person in the other one. Please, you have to keep that in your mind. Number 2, for the last 30 years, under the control, the unique control of the Chinese Communist Party, they have organized and operated a particular kind of economy. Here are the qualities to keep in mind of that economy. Number 1, whereas 40 years ago, the bulk of industry was owned and operated by the government, which in turn was dominated by the Communist Party. Over the last 40 years, a very large portion of the Chinese industrial economy was turned over to private ownership and operation. At the same time, the government's control, which remains very important and very large, was decentralized, so that some government enterprises are owned and operated by the national government, but a lot of them are owned and operated by regional or state governments and also by local, city, and county governments. So when you think of the central government, no, it's a decentralized government. And the job of the central government is mostly the coordination of all of this. The relations among the government enterprises with one another, the relationship of the government enterprises to the private enterprises, the relationships among the private the Communist Party, through the government, regulates and controls all of that. They also opened up, once the United States ended, I assume you're all aware, when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, the United States refused to recognize them. Functioned as if there was nobody there. It was only many years later, under Roosevelt, that the government of the United States recognized the Soviet Union. Same thing happened with the Chinese Revolution in 1949. The government did not recognize them for many years, if you remember, until Nixon and Kissinger opened China up, as if they were closed before. But all that meant was they recognized them. With that recognition, the Chinese began to allow American companies, as they had done with Japanese and Europeans before, to come in. Most of the time, it's very important, most of the time they required the foreign company to be in partnership of some sort with a Chinese company, either a private one or a state one, or even a combination of all three. And a deal was struck, a deal which could not be forced on anybody by the Chinese government, and was not. Here was the deal. I'll use the example of the United States, but the same deal was made with British companies or German companies or Japanese companies. We know why you want to come to China, they said. You want to use our workers who are way cheaper than the workers in your own country. We understand that. We're not stupid. And you want access to our market because we're the biggest country on earth, and even though our people are average low income, we got so many of them that you can sell things. There's always been a fantasy in the West. 100 years ago, it was the fantasy, just imagine if you were a toothbrush maker, if you could be the toothbrush maker for China. All those teeth. Could you sell toothbrushes? Oh my goodness.
The lamps of China.
Yeah, it was, or the lamp, or the toilet paper, or your imagination can take it. So here's the deal that was struck. We know you want to hire our workers who are cheap, who are well disciplined and increasingly well educated. So they're good workers, they're hard workers, they're disciplined workers, and they're cheap. Very attractive. We know you want that. And that's fine. We'll deliver them to you. We also know you want access to the Chinese market. You want to sell into China. We have a growing market. Starting in the 1990s, they had the fastest growing market in the world, which they still do. Don't ever forget it. For the last 25 years, if you're a capitalist anywhere in the world, and if what you're concerned about is the growth of the market for whatever you produce, you've got to be in China because that's the fastest growing demand for everything. And so the Chinese said, we know you want cheap labor and we know you want access to our market. We will give you that. And here's what we want. You've got to give us your technology. You've got to show us the machinery. You have to share your techniques with us so that we can learn them. And there was no hiding it. We want to develop our own industry with these techniques. We want a Chinese industry to develop. We will work together with you. But that's a deal. You don't want the deal, fine. Have a nice day. But if you want the cheap labor of China, and if you want access to the Chinese market, you've got to share your technology, okay? When you hear now both the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, telling you about intellectual property theft, that's what they mean. Here's what they want. They want Americans to have cheap labor, access to China, and give in return nada, which the Chinese say, not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. And so when Mr. Trump said, well, we have to have an agreement on intellectual property, the Chinese say, in Chinese, well, I won't repeat it. You're not going to get that. Okay, next, context before we get to the punchlines. Context. This partly public, partly private capitalist, by the way, all capitalists, if by capitalist you mean the structure of an enterprise in which there's a relatively small number of people who function as the employer and a relatively large number of people who function as the employees, such that the employer pays a wage to the employee. But all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to produce, and what to do with the profits are made by the relatively small group of people or the employers. If that's what you mean by capitalism, and that's certainly what I mean, then both the public and the private enterprises in China were capitalist by that definition. In one case, it was government officials who were the board of directors. In another case, it was private individuals elected by shareholders. So the people were different, and how you got to be the employer was different. But you were an employer faced with employees. You paid wages, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a complicated public and private capitalist system managed by the state, strong regulation, which in turn was managed by a very well-organized, unique political organization, the Communist Party. That was China's economy. That is China's economy. All that's changed is the balance. The relative importance of the private has grown, and the relative importance of the state enterprises has shrunk. But mostly that's it. Now here's the reality. Over the last 25 years, the average annual growth of output, which we call GDP in economics, gross domestic product is what GDP stands for. The growth of the GDP, a convention used all over the world to measure how big an economy is getting, has averaged over 25 years between 6, which is low, which is what it is now, and 9%, sometimes over. Over the same period of time, the growth of the GDP of the United States has fluctuated between 2 and 3%. So let me do that again. Rate of growth of product in this country, 2 to 3% per year. Rate of growth of product in China, 6 to 9%. Do you understand? That's why they're catching up. Because they're growing faster, year in and year out. To those people around the world, and I hope it includes a lot of you in this room, who understand that for most of the people in the world who live in poor countries that have been poor one hell of a long time, the number one objective, whether you agree with it or not is not the question, but the number one objective is to stop being poor and to become comfortable, maybe even rich. If that's your goal, and that's a big one for a lot of people, then the contest between China and the rest of the world is no contest. It's over. The Chinese won. Everybody else lost. Nobody comes close. And for those of you who live in the world where these kinds of informations are somehow not available to you, in the 20th century, there was also one country that grew faster than everybody else. It was called the Soviet Union. If the 20th century fastest grower was the Soviet Union and the 21st century's fastest grower was the People's Republic of China, you ought to draw some implication from this. Something has to occur.
Why did they collapse in '92?
Good. I wish, maybe we'll devote a whole session to why they did. I wrote a book, which any of you are interested in, trying to explain. No, we did, because we felt as Marxists that we had a job to explain why that fell apart, what happened there. Because if Marxists don't explain it, then only the people who don't like Marxism will offer their explanations, and those will be different. Yeah, but it certainly did collapse, and that's an obligation for people like us to explain.
So what was your book?
It's called Class Theory and History. It's published in 2002 by Routledge. It's a big British publisher. And it has a subtitle, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR. It's an attempt to explain why it developed and why it collapsed. Anyway, let's stay with what we are. Second factoid. Over the last 30 years, the average real wage of an American worker has gone nowhere, stagnant, flat, like I mentioned to you earlier. That actually goes back to the late 1970s. The real wage of an average real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was at the end of the 1970s. Over the same period of time, the average